Welcome to the Cowboy Up Podcast, where talk is all about the West. This episode is brought to you by the Dude Ranchers Association and Golden Wings Horseshoes and produced by Cowboy Spirit USA. Back around 1930, there was a lot of interest in Southwest archaeology, but not many women were encouraged to don boots, pants, and a hat and join excavations. Author Shelby Tisdale chats with Russell and Allen about one woman who ignored the norms and became a trailblazer in the field.
You know, Alan, several of our episodes, we've talked about women who've left some heavy footprints on the West. Sarah Lemon, the botanist, to the military wives. Of course, that Vanished Arizona is a great book that almost anybody out here enjoys. And then, of course, the infamous Pearl Hart, who I think is one of the most interesting stories we've had. So I think women are starting to finally get the spotlight they deserve.
Well, you and I were both raised by strong women. My mother graduated from the University of Arizona in 1925, and I'm not sure how many women were in her class, but not a lot. And so she was rowing upstream a lot of her life, but she was strong enough to do it. So,
well, you know, it's interesting. My mother went to Mount Vernon College in Washington, D.C. for 2 years. It was a 2-year, basically, finishing school. And when she finished up there, graduated there, she was going to go to the University of Arizona. And she married my dad instead and didn't go back to school and stayed in Denver and then found her way here. And people who remember her still talk about her strength, grace, and dignity. Not much about her sense of humor, because she didn't have one of those.
Well, my mother was a strong woman and had to be to hold her own there at the ranch in a world of all men. But she used to tell this story a lot. This was kind of not necessarily her favorite story, but she always told it. She said when she told her mother that she was going to marry my father, her mother had one piece of advice for her before she got married. She said, "Don't learn to milk the cow." Which
that was right on
about
point.
As practical as it
yeah, that was right on point. Well, today we're talking about one of the trailblazing female archaeologists in Southwest, Marjorie Lambert. And her story, of course, I love this, doesn't just include archaeology and the digs surrounding them, bit of spelunking, but she was also involved in dude ranching. I love that. And Marjorie Lambert's biographer, Dr. Shelby Tisdale, is here. She's the retired director of the Center of Southwest Studies at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. She's been a museum administrator, consultant, curator, university professor. She's worked for museums in different capacities, Santa Fe and Taos, as well as the Gene Autry Museum in Los Angeles. She's a prolific author. She's written about American Indian art, culture, repatriation, and women in the West. She recently she received her PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Arizona, where your mother went, and recently moved back to Tucson. Her new book is No Place for a Lady, The Life Story of Marjorie F. Lambert. It's a University of Arizona Press book that will be published in June. It's great to have you, Shelby. Welcome back to Tucson.
Thank you so much, Russell and Alan. This is exciting for me to be on this program and so exciting to be back in Tucson.
Well, welcome, of course, but glad to have you. Love where you are, and what you've been interested in Marjorie Lambert. And so give us some background on Marjorie and what and where in her background.
I would love to. Marjorie was born Marjorie Elizabeth Ferguson in 1908 in Colorado Springs. And she was a descendant of one of Colorado's oldest pioneer families. And her father was from Scotland, and he was a prolific reader and would send Marjorie to the library all the time for books, and she would come across books on archaeology and Egyptology and history and read them along with her father, and kind of got a little bit of an introduction when she was a child.
Interesting. So she became interested in the archaeology during college. Is that correct? And that maybe that was atypical for women?
That's correct. She attended Colorado College, and one of her professors there, an anthropology professor, would invite scholars, archaeologists, to come and speak to the class. And so he would invite these Southwest archaeologists to come up, and she just really became very, very interested in archaeology, and especially Southwest archaeology. And of course, at that time, in the early 1900s, the sciences were pretty much dominated by men, and so, and including archaeology, and so few women were involved in the field at that time.
Well, on our outline here, it said she was sent out. One of her first jobs was sent out to supervise a dig, and apparently that wasn't done very much. So describe that a little bit, if you would.
That's right. Her mentor was one of those professors that came up to talk to at Colorado College. His name was Edgar Lee Hewitt. And Hewitt was very responsible for the development of Southwest archaeology, especially the professionalization of it. And he also taught at the University of New Mexico. And when Marjorie went to graduate school, she was invited to go up to go down to UNM, where Hewitt was. And after she finished her master's degree, she was invited to go out to what was called New Mexico Normal University at the time. It is now Highlands University, to teach a class, a summer anthropology and archaeology class, which involved both in-class lectures as well as field work at the Tecolodi site. And she was very young, and she was still in her 20s, and she organized the crew. She had both students as well as other crew members, and they did this fantastic excavation at this Tecolodi site. And that was her first experience of really going out and running her own crew. She
kind of jumped in at the top then, didn't she?
She did. And when she went out to do this, she was told by many of her male peers that she wouldn't be able to get any men to work for her. And she proved them wrong.
So what was the Tecolodi site? What were they excavating? What were they looking for there? Or what did
this
they find?
This was partly an ancestral Puebloan site, as well as a Plains Apache site. It was had a later occupation as well, but most of it dated around 1300, and it was a site that was actually eroding out of the banks of a wash, and so it was in many ways kind of a salvage project, because the site was going to be pretty much washed away. So they were able to recover quite a lot of information. And what was interesting was the evidence of later occupation, historic occupation by the Apache as well. So it's an interesting site.
Were you out on the dig? Have you been out to that site?
I have not been out to that site. There have been other excavations in that area over the years, but unfortunately I never did make it out to that site.
And so you said 1300, and that was the ancestral Pueblo era, That's
correct. It would have been the very tail end of it. Yeah, more almost the proto-historic. Right. But she did work on a number of other excavations that were more of the ancestral Puebloan sites. She worked at Quawa, which is became Coronado State Monument there in Bernalillo, just by Albuquerque. And that was a large site with a painted kiva, which was really interesting. That dated more around 1150. So it was a little bit earlier. And then she worked on a number of other ancestral Puebloan sites as well. And
I have two questions along those lines. So the Plains Apaches, you said, were the later. And when Apaches, as I understand it, Athabascan came in from the northwest, when did they come into that space, roughly?
Oh, gosh. They came in very, very early on, probably around the Navajo in particular in the New Mexico area, which is probably simultaneous with a lot of the Apache, came in around the 1300s.
Okay, because I've read everything from 13 to late 14s. So
is it generally true that the Navajos were the farmers and the Apaches were the more, I would call them invaders, but not really meaning that. They were not as much farmers, but hunter-gatherers, yeah. Would that differentiate them some?
Yes, and also just the style of living, with the Navajos living in hogans, whereas the Apaches lived more in teepees and things like that. And also the Apaches had, they used horses a lot more than the Navajo did at that time, especially early on. And so there was a lot of, and they were going out on the plains, of course, and hunting buffalo and larger game animals. So, yeah, it was a little different kind of, living and culture.
And the Apaches hunted buffalo? And where?
Yeah,
there were buffalo out on the southern plains at that point in time.
Here in New Mexico and Arizona?
Well, when you think of where, Tecolote, it's in Las Vegas, New Mexico, so it's right along that border between the southern plains and more of the New Mexico highlands. So it's right there, right on that fringe.
So this is off topic from Marjorie, but I've always wanted to ask this question. So the Apaches and the Navajos came out of the Northwest into Texas, Arizona, New Mexico. Is the thinking that they came in as separate groups with common heritage, or did they separate once they were here?
Well, that's a very good question. They all share similar language to the Athabascan speakers in the north. And so, but they're different dialects, and the Apache Athabascan speakers cannot really talk to the Navajo Athabascan speakers. Their languages diverged. I'm not a linguist, so I can't really go into a lot of detail on that, but they just developed differently culturally. Good question, because when they came from the north, they probably came down in different groups and just ended up diverging and going out into different areas of the Southwest.
They spoke a common language, or pretty much so?
Very similar, yeah. Different dialects of it, but similar language.
And both those groups, of course, have such a big history in Arizona and such a big impact that it's interesting.
Absolutely, yes.
Really latecomers relative. So Ancestral Pueblo, what would, prior to that being the common name, would these have been Anasazi, which later was not such a great word to use, or would they have been a different group?
Yes.
The folks at Tecolote.
Yeah, the more accepted term today is Ancestral Puebloan.
Right.
But yes, in the past, and you'll see this in early writings, of course, they're referred to as the Anasazi.
Right. Okay.
And that's a Navajo term that is used.
Right.
Is that a derogatory term? Is that why it got thrown out, or what caused us to speak differently of them?
Yes, because in the Navajo language, it was considered to be an enemy. And as archaeologists started to work more collaboratively with Native groups here in the Southwest, especially the Pueblos said, we don't like that term, and we prefer not to be referred to that term ancestrally. And these are our ancestors that are, these sites are where our ancestors live. And we want to respect that. And so that's where the term ancestral Puebloan came from. And that's what we use today.
And what out of use terms would that now encompass beside Anasazi?
Oh, gosh.
Because are there Mogollon and Sinagua and some of the...
There's Hocom. There's a lot of different terms, but those refer to specific areas.
I see.
Like ancestral Puebloan is more of the Four Corners, Rio Grande area.
Okay.
And then of course you get down into the southern part of New Mexico and Arizona. You get the Mogollon, and then get into central Arizona. You have the Hohokam, and of course there's the Sinagua and the Fremont, and those are terms that are used by archaeologists to because the evidence in the ground for all these different cultures are very different. And so they're very distinctive, I would say. And so that's how we can say, well, that is Mogollon, or, that ceramic piece is Mogollon, or that ceramic piece might be Hohokam.
Got it.
Did they exchange ideas a lot, or was each Pueblo on its own and develop its own culture, so that they may have the same biological background but be different in how they lived?
Well, it's very interesting because a lot of recent research that has been done with archaeologists collaborating with present-day descendant communities, it has been really interesting how, we kind of pigeonhole these groups that lived, back thousands of years in these little pockets, but people were moving all over the landscape. And the Hopi in particular, they have all of these oral histories of all these clans coming from all over, from all directions, and settling into Hopi. And at one point, all these clans may have been speaking different languages. And some left and some stayed, and even at Hopi today, there's certain differences in language. So, and that is based on clans. And the same thing with when people left Mesa Verde, they moved south into the Jemez Mountains and down along the Rio Grande. Other groups came from other places and settled into where they are now today.
Interesting.
So, yeah, it's a fascinating history. There's a really good book called Becoming Hopi that just came out from the University of Arizona Press last year that goes into a lot of detail about this, specifically with the Hopi.
Well, with that, we're going to take a break, and then you had not all people who write biographies get to meet the person. And you did, yes. So we're going to come back with that in just a moment. We're just winding up, I guess, spring breaks here at White Stallion. And, of course, now we're going to hand off the family travel baton to Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, California, etc. when they're going to take over all those great family vacations. Of course, we're open too, but the DRA is where the Dude Ranchers Association, we call it the DRA, is where you should go to find out about the 90 vetted, qualified. It's a big process. Members of that group that's coming up 100 years old. This is the Western version of the all-inclusive vacation. It's the American West's first destination vacation. But it's not just riding anymore. It's UTVs, ATVs, mountain bikes, of course, hiking, whitewater rafting, fishing, archery, shooting, crafting, all kinds of stuff, but all with that core experience that the DRA calls the 6 H's: horses, hats, hospitality, heritage, heart, and honesty. And that is the core of what we all believe in at DRA Ranches. You can find out about all of them at www.duderanch.org, www.duderanch.org, or call them, and they can help guide you if you're having a hard time choosing from all those ranches. So, Shelby, you met Marjorie. Can you tell us about that?
I did. I was very, very fortunate to meet Marjorie when I did. I was working on my master's degree, and I was at the School of American Research, which is now called the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe. And I was working at the Indian Art Research Center there. And I would go over and pick Marjorie up to bring her to the SAR for meetings, like collections committee meetings and board meetings and so on, because she was going blind at the time. Oh. And one day she mentioned to me how frustrated she was getting because her blindness was getting worse. And she said, I'm getting to the point I can't read anything, even with this machine that she had. And I said, well, I'd be happy to come over and read to you. And so we set up Wednesday nights. I went over every Wednesday night, and we'd have a little dinner and a little glass of wine or a margarita or something. And I would sit and read to her. And oftentimes after we'd finish reading, our discussions would start focusing on her life and what it was like being a woman in the field. And I was starting my career, and we were comparing notes. It was so interesting. And then when I started graduate school here at the University of Arizona, I started working for Nancy Parizo, and she and Barbara Babcock had published a book called Daughters of the Desert, which was all about women anthropologists and archaeologists who had worked in the Southwest. And Marjorie was in that book. And so Nancy and I started talking at some point about how these women needed to have more of a fuller story told about their lives. And one day when I was in Santa Fe, I asked Marjorie if she'd would let me write a biography on her. And she was very humble, and at first said, "Oh, no. And then the more we talked, I said, "No, your life is really important and interesting. I think we should do this."
That's
so
terrific.
35 years later, I finally got the project finished.
Well, that's a great story. Yeah. So as we go forward, Marjorie left the field in 1937 to go to work and do museum work in Santa Fe. What was she doing?
It was interesting because when she was teaching at the University of New Mexico, and Edgar Lee Hewitt, who was the director of the Museum of New Mexico and the School of American Research at the time, brought her up to Santa Fe to be the curator of archaeology. And she was one of 3 women that were curators of archaeology, one of the first 3 in the Southwest. And so she started working. One of the first things she started doing was trying to figure out the collections, because they were just a mess. Everything was just thrown in the basement. So she started organizing the archaeology and historical collections, and then she started working on the exhibits, which were at the time just kind of like what we would call cabinets of curiosity, just cabinets with stuff in them, no interpretation. So that was her big focus was doing interpretive exhibits, trying to explain the material and putting it into some sort of context.
And displayed where?
That was in the Palace of the Governors in Santa Fe, which is now part of the History Museum. But the Palace of the Governors was the original Museum of New Mexico. And it was, at that point, a 400-year-old building. It was built by the Spanish. And that's why it's called the Palace of the Governors.
Right.
It housed the Spanish governors.
You still see her influence on the work when you go there to see the museum?
Not so much anymore because, over time, museum exhibits have modernized and, new bells and whistles are added to exhibits all the time. And when she was doing her exhibits, there was no money whatsoever. I mean, for her to display costumes, for example, she would go over to the department store and borrow mannequins. I mean, that they just had no money whatsoever. They would paint grapefruit juice cans to use as props in the exhibit cases. So, she was very, very creative in her exhibits, but people loved them. The public loved her exhibits because they were so good at explaining the archaeology and the history of the area.
What's there now? Has that evolved into really something that people are interested in?
Yes. The Palace of the Governors portion of the History Museum is closed right now. They're doing some renovating, but it's a wonderful area for exhibits on the history of New Mexico in particular, especially the indigenous history as well as the Spanish history. Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, which is in Santa Fe, focuses more on the Native American aspect of collections these days, but a lot of her exhibits would focus on the Native Americans as well, and she worked a lot with collaboratively with Native Americans for her exhibits. If she had something she wasn't sure what it was, she would go out to the pueblos and ask them, for example.
And that was obviously then productive for her to do that. They knew through tradition.
Yes.
The answers.
Yeah. Yes.
So, of course, I'm a dude rancher, lifetimer. No other marketable skills. I'm interested that I understand Marjorie married a cowboy from Santa Fe, and he was also a dude rancher. Am I getting that right?
That's right. So, her second husband was Everett V. Lambert, and he was known as Jack Lambert because Jack, he was kind of a jack of all trades. Jack was born in 1898 in Okarche, Oklahoma, and he left home at 14 on a horse and rode to Wyoming on horseback and his first job was working as a horse wrangler for these two bachelors who, after a year, decided this was too hard to do, especially after their first winter in Wyoming. And he and another cowboy went down to Utah, and they helped build a bridge over the Green River between Cisco, Utah, and Moab. And then after that, he went down to Santa Fe, and he was sitting just on a bench out in front of a drugstore. in the plaza there in Santa Fe, and this man came up to him and said, "Are you Jack Lambert?" And he said, "Yeah." And Jack and this fellow said, "Well, I need some help. I'm putting a dude ranch together, and I need some help. And I hear you're really good with horses and people." And Jack said, "Sure." So his name was Roy Faffel, and so they were hired to start a dude ranch at what is now the Bishop's Lodge in Santa Fe, but it was called Bishop's Ranch at the time. And they did this for about 7 years, and they decided they didn't really like the owner so much, so they started their own dude ranch up around Alcalde called San Gabriel. And what Jack would do is he would take people out on horseback and take them all over the Four Corners area. And probably the most famous person that he took out to the Navajo reservation was Mary Cabot Wheelwright. She was an Easterner. She was considering moving to Santa Fe. He took her out to the Navajo reservation, and she was just madly in love with the Southwest, and she started her own museum called the Wheelwright Museum of Native American Religion, Navajo religion. It's now changed to just the Wheelwright Museum, but he would take people out all over the place, and then after about 10 years, he and Roy kind of had a falling out, and he started working for the White Sisters in Santa Fe, and he pretty much built their estate. A lot of the buildings on that estate were built by Jack and his brother. And he still had horses. He had a little corral with some horses, but by then he was no longer doing the dude ranching. He was working pretty much full time for these two women. So,
well, Santa Fe area is the location for most of us who are dude ranchers. I think it was published in 1958, a book called Guestward Ho. And do you know the book?
No, I'm writing it down though. So
Guestward Ho, it's long out of print, but it's pretty easy to get because they must have, it was pretty successful, and it was written along with a guy named Patrick Dennis, who had written Annie Mame and had some fame. Barbara Hooton was the owner of the ranch. And so it was, I can't think of the name of the ranch, but it was outside Santa Fe. And they had all the problems that dude ranchers have. And so it was a really good book. The other connection that I think you may know some of is one of our little ranches is Rancho de la Osa, which is on the border with Mexico near Sassabee. And it's 3 podcasts worth of history. It's an unbelievable collection of unexpected history in this out of the way place. But where it connects to you is Louisa Wetherill came through with a Navajo medicine man whose name also escapes me at the moment. And they were, depending on which book you read, either looking for some petroglyphs that were thought to be in northern Mexico sacred to the Navajos or a lost tribe of Navajos. But in any case, they came through Rancho de la Osa in 1923 or 24. She ended up leasing and then buying the ranch and starting a dude ranch there in either 24 or 26, again, depending on if you read her book or someone else's. But the Wetherills were, of course, the family that guided, maybe discovered Mesa Verde, that spectacular ancestral Pueblan ruin.
That's right. I mean, Richard Wetherill's ranch was right there in Mancos, which is, you stand in Mancos and you're just looking right up at Mesa Verde, and right at the foot of it along the Mancos River. And of course they were out, the Wetherills were out in Chaco Canyon and lived out there for quite a while. And actually Richard was murdered out there. But it's the Wetherills have a fascinating history in that Four Corners area, especially the Mesa Verde area, for sure.
I missed who was murdered?
Richard. Wetherill.
I never read. I didn't know that.
Yes, yeah. And it was a very mysterious one, too, in terms of who actually murdered him. The Wetherill.
Was the ranch controversial, or what would set the stage for a murder?
Well, that's a good question, because if it was a Navajo, it may have been because they were doing archaeology there, and they were also bringing out big expeditions from the east, like the Hyde expedition, to do all these excavations at places like Pueblo Bonito and Chetrokettle, and they may have been disturbing some Navajo graves as well, since the Navajos lived in that area, after the ancestral Puebloan people left. And so, good question. It's a bit of a mystery.
Yeah, doesn't sound too controversial, but must have been. I mean, mad enough to kill somebody over. Yes. And, could have been some other things, too. They may have felt like, these white ranchers just came in and just kind of settled in there, and it was their kind of homeland. Could have been a number of different things that sparked it.
Reading some of the including Louisa Wetherill's own book, Traitor to the Navajos, she was embraced and considered spiritually a Navajo, according to her, at least, and other things I've read. So it may have been not at all focused on her, but didn't mean that Richard got to ride in the same train.
And just interpretation of just somebody coming along, just going, this doesn't sit right. So who knows?
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. So anyway, back to Marjorie. She went back to the field in 1960?
Yes. So she actually, I should just mention why I bring Jack up in this book is because Marjorie met Jack at a party in 1936, and that was right before she went up to the museum to work. But she was working at the museum temporarily, and she had gone to this party, and she just met Jack, and they went out on a couple of dates. But he was 11 years older than her, and she remembered her mother saying, "Don't ever, marry an older man. They're no good." She decided to cut it off, and then 14 years later in Santa Fe, Jack was in a store and saw Marjorie and realized he was still smitten with her, and so he followed up to make sure she was single and contacted her, and then they started going out again, and then they got married in 1950 after 14 years.
Interesting love story.
And they had such a wonderful life together. I mean, he was not an archaeologist, but he supported her, and they both loved Native American art and Hispano art. They had numerous Native American Hispano friends and just treasured everybody and loved the Southwest. That was their passion. So they had a great life together.
So back to her, did she go back out to the field in 1960?
She finally did. One of her biggest frustrations in working in the museum was that she wasn't able to get out to do field work. But she finally convinced the School of American Research to give her some funding to go out and do some survey work in Hidalgo County. It's the boot heel of New Mexico, and to do some excavation. And one of the reasons was this area was being heavily looted. These sites were being heavily looted and by collectors and by people who were selling a lot of the artifacts on the market and so on. And so she argued that, we needed to get out there and do some survey work before it's all gone, basically. And so they excavated that summer, they excavated 3 caves, and one of the best known caves is called U-Bar Cave. And that was where she excavated this hair net. It was a net that was made from human hair. It is about 150 feet long. So it was a major, major find. And then they found a basket that had just whole hunks of hair that were tied. And then the other thing that's probably best known from coming out of that particular cave is this Tlaylock figure. It's a wooden figure with these big bulging eyes, and it was such an extraordinary figure. She took it out to all these different pueblos, and they said, nope, it's not a Kachina. It doesn't relate to us at all. And so she started doing a little more research and found that this similar kind of figure existed in Mesoamerica. And we have subsequently figured, yes, this is called Tlaylock. And that's a revered figure in Mesoamerica. And we find it a lot, in sculptures and all kinds of architecture and so on in Mesoamerica. It's kind of like a rain god. So one of the things Marjorie started to do was connect this area of the Southwest to Mesoamerica and looking at the influences going back and forth. And she was a pioneer in doing this. And
what were the years that you're talking about that these came from?
This is probably in the 1200s, maybe 1150s, somewhere in that range. So,
and extending on how long?
Probably extending to, there was actually more, again, there was some Apache influence later on, in the higher, when they first started excavating, they found some Apache material, and then as they started going further down is when they started finding more of the, like Mogollon type material. So it had some more recent occupation as well. Another cave that was really interesting there is called Buffalo Cave, and that actually had a pictograph of a buffalo painted on the wall in the back of that cave. So it was a fascinating area. She wanted to go back out in 1961, but unfortunately she was prevented from going out by the director of the Museum of New Mexico at the time and the Laboratory of Anthropology, saying that she had other work to do and wouldn't give her a release time to go back out, which was very unfortunate. And
is there any work being done now over in Hidalgo County?
That's your area of the country, isn't it?
I was raised in Lordsburg, so I'm curious because that's right in my backyard.
Right. Well, there is certainly work being done further north of you, more up around the Silver City, up in the Gila area.
Yeah.
That's where a lot of the archaeological work is being done.
Well, it makes sense because it's a little higher altitude up there and there's running water, and further south it gets pretty dry and it's more seasonal if people were living there because not a lot of running water south of there.
That's absolutely right. Absolutely right. Yes. Yeah.
Well, we've run over as we do. Your book, No Place for a Woman, The Life Story of Marjorie F. Lambert. And again, people can put their hands on that in June. Is there pre-ordering happening yet, or are we too far ahead of that?
No, you can pre-order it both University of Arizona Press, or you can also pre-order it on Amazon. So, it's going to be available soon, and I'm excited. I'm excited about it coming out.
Well, I hope you sell 1 million of them.
Thank you. I do too.
And you've done some other books, is that correct?
Yes.
And,
yes, I have.
And people can look you up how to learn about them?
Yeah, actually, if you just Google my name, those books will come up. Amazon also carries some of those books. Another book that I finished 2 years ago is called Federico, and it's one man's journey from Tututepec to Los Angeles, and it's about his life story as well of growing up as a Mixtec indigenous boy in southern Oaxaca, and then how he ended up in Los Angeles. And he's a really well-known jewelry artist. And
Federico.
Federico. And in both books, I should just mention in Marjorie's book is I had the opportunity to tape record her, and so I use her voice throughout this book to tell her story.
Oh, that's terrific.
Yeah.
That's terrific. Well, so Shelby Tisdale, and that's Shelby Tisdale, Tisdale. Is that right?
That's correct.
And do you have a website?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, it's coming. But then Google you said, and it's all out there. So,
yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and love to learn a little more about things I didn't know a bit that were right under my doorstep.
Oh, well, it's such a pleasure to meet both of you, and thank you so much for having me on your program.
Well, once you get settled in, come visit White Stallion, and we'll see you out here.
I would absolutely love to. That's on my to-do list for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
All
you
right.
for the invitation. All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You know, Alan and I want to thank the folks at Golden Wings for sponsoring us. They've been doing that for a long time. But, you know, I want to thank them for something more important, and that's for their shoes. And this is our most recent story. We had a horse that was brought here from one of our other ranches, and they said, you know, this horse just, you know, he just seems like every step hurts, and he's not really lame, and we can't figure it out, and he's just not making it. So we brought him here, and we discovered the same. I rode him myself, and he wasn't conventionally lame, and when he stepped on a rock, it wasn't as if it was some kind of rock soreness like some horses have, but he just seemed to feel his feet in a general sense. So first thing we did is we pulled those steel shoes off. We put some Golden Wings on. I did it myself because I wanted it a certain way. And then we gave him a week off. And at the end of that week, I didn't ride him myself that first time, but watched one of our wranglers ride him off, and he just stepped out like life had just gotten a whole lot less heavy. And so he's back to work and doing well, and I think there's only one way that would have happened, and that's Golden Wings horseshoes. So if you're finding anything that you think you need a new solution for your horse's soundness and get that concussion absorption and all that great flexibility, go to goldenwingshorseshoes.com. goldenwingshorseshoes.com.
All right, friends, thanks for joining us. A Cowboy shout out to Stan Houston and his production company. If you're interested in other episodes about strong women, email us at thecowboyuppodcast@gmail.com, and we'll direct you to some of those wonderful episodes. Be sure to join us next week when the Cowboys chat with Jeff Kidda, longtime photographer for the renowned magazine Arizona Highways. Until then, I'm Lynn Weezy Sneed, reminding you to sit tall and ride safe.